to say. So, President, let me just request that you do the honors of introducing to us our guest.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon to all of you. First of all, let me welcome the Honorable Minister of Sport and Arts and Culture, Mr. Nkosinathi Emmanuel Mthethwa. Our minister is a product of the trade union movement as well as the youth movement. He was part of Operation Vula, and he is a veteran of the liberation struggle. He's a senior member of Cabinet of the Republic of South Africa, having served from 2008 to the present in various positions as first the Minister of Safety and Security, later renamed the Minister of Police. He then served as Minister of Arts and Culture and presently served as the Minister of Sport, Art and Culture. Minister Mthethwa was also a member of our board of the 2010 FIFA World Cup Organizing Committee. And there he made the big challenge that we had as we moved around the world. The first question would always be, is it safe? What about crime? And we can now say that we delivered a safe World Cup, not a single incident, a major incident. And we want to, on this day, one day after the final of the World Cup in our country on the 11th of July, thank the Minister for his huge contribution and also welcome him. Thank you very much. What's happening now?
I think the minister is still on mute.
Oh, well, thanks, Mpho, and thanks, President of SAFA. In fact, I thought Mpho was saying he's still going to come back. That's why I was waiting. But thank you very much, our program director today, Mpho Tsedu, the president of SAFA, Dr. Jordan. I've seen Mr. Tovi Mkuku here with us, Mr. Amankwa, Mr. Rathbone. We also have Mr. Mandela, everybody, members of the public, of the media, ladies and gentlemen. And thanks, the President of SAFA, for the introduction. Perhaps all of us here, with the panel I've just mentioned, the first thing we would have received from Madiba today, he would have chastised us for having a boys' club. We have had interactions with him over a period of time, and he was very sensitive to that. I'm referring here to ourselves as a panel. Perhaps it's one thing, unless I'm leaving somebody else. It's one thing as we go forward, we need to pay attention to the ensuring that at all times we strive for a non-sexist situation and gender equality. I extend my warmest greetings to all of you, those who have tuned in, and ourselves here. And these indeed are extraordinary times. As humanity, we face an unprecedented times due to coronavirus pandemic, otherwise known as COVID-19. The impact of this pandemic has never been seen in our lives. It's only matched with the Spanish flu of 1918. So in its wake, the Spanish flu claimed more than 300,000 lives in Western Cape alone. That was 5% of the entire population of South Africa at the time. Therefore, it is important that we remind ourselves of the obvious, that at all times we observe health protocols to try and flatten the curve as government and society, particularly led by the Ministry of Health, is nudging all of us to do. Whilst we face these challenges, we must be grateful of the fact that we have time to sit like this and reflect on different aspects in society, including sport. And for us to do this, it's something which reminds us that it was not an automatic thing. It came as a result of a protracted struggle for liberation. Many people paid ultimate price for this, and this year in particular is a centenary for quite a number of those people who made it a point that they were able to sit like this and have a discussion. And one of them next year would have turned 150 years old, and that's Ma Charlotte Manyamatleke. Ma Charlotte Manyamatleke, we take leave from her life and her teaching, which was premised on a philosophy, where she said, and I quote, "This work is not for yourself. Kill that spirit of self. Do not live above your people. Live with them." So that is one aspect as we count down to her 150th anniversary next year, which is guiding us and should guide us. A couple of them would have turned 100 years this year, and one of them in this month in particular, and that is Heritemba Kwala, Isitolandwe. We have people like Vwisile Mini, Raymond Mhlaba, Marimuthu Naika, Robert Gesha, Lionel Rusty Bernstein in our country, in South Africa. But also if we look outside of our borders, we have people like Eduardo Mondlane. These people and these giants of our country and those outside of South Africa lived because they had surrendered their very beings to the people as a whole. They lived because their very beings embodied love, an idea, a hope, an aspiration, a vision of our collective destiny. We should always reflect on that. Coming back to the matter at hand today, this very important topic, particularly as the president of SAFA has mentioned, that it's a decade after we hosted the world as South Africa. And we did that not as South Africa, but as part of the continent, because it indeed was an African showpiece. When we look at the question of sport diplomacy, diplomacy is the management of international relations by negotiation, the method by which these relations are adjusted by ambassadors and envoys. Sport can play, and we've seen in our situation, it has played an important role in this process because of its universal popularity and its ability to serve as a common ground between nations. It also allows hosts and guests to converse about an issue they both have common knowledge and can feel comfortable to disagree on because of its non-sensitive nature. The popularity of world-class sport events enable the initiation of multilateral diplomacy. In terms of foreign policy tools, sport also serves as an instrument to wield what we like to call soft power. Just to give a few examples of sport diplomacy that were successful. The cricket diplomacy between India and Pakistan offered an illustration of successful sport diplomacy in 2004. After a break of 15 years, India taught Pakistan, in the wake of diplomatic initiatives, to bury half a century of mutual hostility. Both sides relaxed their tough visa regulations for each other, allowing thousands of fans to travel across the border. So you can deduct from here and see demonstrably the power of sport, of even bridging the gap in conflictual situations. Sport in executing foreign policy originally stemmed from a nation-building effort by individual countries to foster a sense of nation through competition against another country. Another example, Tanzania. Tanzania used sport to unify its population that consists of many different language communities and to advance its foreign policy objectives. It used sport to foster and promote African unity amongst African countries. It also led in the sporting isolation of apartheid South Africa and Rhodesia from international sporting events such as Olympics and other mega sporting events. When we look closer home here in South Africa, in our case, the link between sporting superiority and white South African culture spread to the social relationship between linguistic communities of our country, that is between black and white, where rugby and cricket expressed the dominance of the white minority, especially the folk. Sport in South Africa came to be a divisive social fracture that was consistent with the apartheid policy of the day. Sport was used by apartheid regime to explain, and I quote, "There was no segregation as blacks simply liked their soccer and Afrikaners preferred their rugby," close quote. Now, this statement undergirds the perspective of the apartheid regime, which was flawed, of course, because if we trace the history of sport in this country, rugby was played by Africans as well. Now, this kind of philosophy was the one which propelled the apartheid regime. The sport, cultural and academic boycotts was directly felt not only by the white racist government, but by ordinary white South Africans. And this resulted in more internal pressure being felt by the then racist government. If you look at the post-94 scenario, sport came to play an important part in welcoming the new South Africa and how we reintroduced ourselves to the world community. The hosting of the two mega sporting events, the Rugby World Cup and the African Cup of Nations, allowed South Africa to use sport diplomacy to promote itself as a vibrant, integrated culture and as a new democracy. The story of Nelson Mandela, trotting out in front of 50,000 predominantly white South Africans at Ellis Park whilst wearing a green Springbok jersey, is well known to everybody. This event is recognized by the majority of South Africans as the moment that contributed significantly in our efforts of nation building and underlined the importance of sport diplomacy. The hosting of 1996 African Cup of Nations was another mega event. though in a lesser scale compared to the 1995 Rugby World Cup. The African Cup of Nations saw a mixing of both black and white on the sporting field that the Springboks had yet to attain. The hosting and winning of African Cup of Nations in 96 was very similar to those of 1995, but the distinct feature was that the fans were more diverse, reflecting the demographics of our country. The impact of hosting mega sporting events, such as the rugby, football tournaments that South Africa hosted in 95 and 96, shaped the perception of the Republic in the eyes of the world that little else could do. And here I'm talking about all other avenues of life you can think of in society, which could not reach this power of sport to reach out to the world and present a case for South Africa. It is therefore was not surprising that down the line we became the host of FIFA World Cup, because the world had seen South Africa through the eyes of sport. And it was this prism which sent a message to the world that we are a nation in building, we are striving for unity in our own nation. We have seen that mega sporting events focus the world's attention like little else, and that a country's performance as host often has dramatic ramifications in affecting the nation's brand abroad. Now, what lessons do we derive out of sport diplomacy? One, sport provides an unofficial reason and location for international leaders to meet and begin dialogue and conversation about a whole host of things, from political, social, economic. All those become possible because of the power of sport diplomacy. Sport provides insight into the host country and educate others about it. The impression people had of us, as the president of SAFA has related, the world was looking at us in a negative light, that you are hosting this World Cup, but you have crime. There's going to be chaos in your country and so on. But through sport, the world was educated differently about South Africa. And it bridged cultural and linguistic differences amongst nations. Sport can be used to create awareness for international relationships through sport ambassadors. Sport events can be used to create a legacy for a host country, improving its image in the world. Sport can be used to create legitimacy for a new nation, As I conclude, the program director, I want to emphasize the point that sport plays an enormous role in our daily lives. This is one aspect of life where everybody, young, old, black, white, rich, poor, have something to exchange in conversation about. This is the aspect of our life where ordinary people are experts in, and similar to other cultural global phenomena such as popular music, food, and dance. Sport entails a universal language that everyone speaks. As a former president, the late President Madiba, once stated, and I quote, "Sport has the power to change the world, to inspire and to unite people in a way that very little else can." To that extent, Program Director, I would want to thank you for your attention and the opportunity.
Yambosa, thank you very much, and indeed for that contribution that you have just made here. It's going to be a very interesting dialogue here, I must say. The Center for Africa-China Studies in the UJ Library are bringing us this dialogue, of course, in partnership with the IFA. Minister, you have raised various issues relating to what sports diplomacy is. But let me just remind our audience that we have here the president of SAFA, Ntate Jordan. We have here the former captain of Bafana Bafana, Neil Tovey. We have here Gary Rathbone, one of the most well-traveled producers on the African continent and globally. We have here Kujo Amankwa, the Ghanaian-born African soccer journalist. And we will definitely have a good time. But before we do that, let me just, from an academic point, quickly invite David Maimela. David Maimela is a former student activist. He's currently also a board member at the SABC, but his daily job involves, of course, taking care of the health matters of the province of Gauteng as the head of the MEC's office. But over and above that, David is a specialist on international relations and foreign policy. He has written extensively, a founding member of MISTRA there. David, quickly just share with us, what is this soccer diplomacy that we're talking about from an academic point? And perhaps you will find time to also go into that paper that you wrote some time back regarding the 2010 World Cup.
Yeah, well, thank you, Mpo. Thank you very much for this opportunity, and really a happy birthday and a gracious anniversary to our founding father, President Nelson Mandela. Really, thank you for this opportunity. I think that what I really am going to do quite briefly, and hopefully I can do so in quite a few strokes, is that I'll speak about the role and the leadership of the former president in relation to sports diplomacy in general, but football diplomacy in particular. And in this regard, I'm just going to be deliberate that conceptually and historically, we consider rugby to be part of the broader family of football, just like you would have a soccer and the American football, etc., etc. So in that instance, for me, I think it is important to always associate Nelson Mandela with the three major, or what they normally refer to as mega events, that have taken place here in our shores. Let me start off by saying that the task of former President Mandela, insofar as our foreign policy is concerned, was very simple, straightforward, and very direct. The first task that he had in his hand was to basically reinsert South Africa into the global community of nations. And secondly, it was for him to basically express and expose to the entire world the new founding values of our new democratic society. Starting from 1994. And in that way, then he sought to basically reset our foreign policy agenda, and he had to make sure that we actually do away with our previous kind of image as a pariah, in the global community. And I think I must also say that he also associates with sports and football in particular, because he himself was an amateur boxer, as you remember. So he understood the power and the role of sports in society, which I'll speak to quite briefly. So I think that one of the things that will always be associated with Nelson Mandela are the three global stages that he actually walked through insofar as football is concerned. The first one really was in 1995, which was also a platform that was basically used to project our values as a country insofar as a reconciliation is concerned, insofar as human rights are concerned. I think that particular stage actually projected South Africa as this country that is coming out of a very deeply racialized society into a world where we pursue non-racialism. And as you can see today, insofar as that is concerned, football actually is more than any other sporting code, has got a more unifying force across the world. Even today, even though fans are not going to the stadiums, but people are still united behind football. But the challenge is no longer with the former president about defeating racism in sports and in society. The challenge is now with us. I think the former president did the best that he could as a leader, and as a leader who emerged out of concrete South African conditions to actually project those values that actually we are all part of a human race rather than belonging to various racial categories. And I think he succeeded in that regard. So if you look at what is happening in America today and you look at what is happening in Europe, whether you look at Mario Balotelli's incidents around race, whether you look at Samuel Eto'o and many other players that have suffered at the hands of racism. But football, FIFA has got a very clear campaign globally to actually pursue a non-racialism. So that's one aspect. Then in 1996, really, at the AFCON, Madiba used that particular stage to basically reinsert South Africa into the African region to simply project the message that South Africa is actually part of Africa and that South Africa cannot succeed without being part of Africa. That if Africa fails, South Africa fails, and if South Africa succeeds, then the entire continent succeeds. And I think that he actually projected that very well by making sure that, firstly, South Africa becomes a country that is re-embraced by the rest of the continent. People could really come here and see South Africa as brother and sister. People could really see South Africa as an investment destination, as a place to visit for tourist purposes, etc. Then in 2010, of course, as a statesman now, long after he had retired from politics officially, then in 2010, really, he also again used his stature as an international statesman, as a man of peace and as a man of international cooperation, as a man of reconciliation, to actually say to the entire world, it is now time for us to return back to Africa, where human civilization had actually begun. And this was the most fundamental symbolism about it. So I think that those particular three moments and those particular three stages were quite crucial and critical to project South Africa and Nelson Mandela as a person who stood for peace, a person who stood for human rights globally, and a person who stood for international cooperation and development. Well, again, the challenge is actually with us, whether have we used the 1995 Rugby World Cup, the 1996 AFCON, the 2010 World Cup to actually build on those moments and that momentum to actually attract more investment into the country, more tourism into the country, more international cooperation, more trade into the country, more even African intercontinental trade. So I think that Madiba has actually done a lot in achieving and setting the stage and resetting the agenda. So he has done his part. It's now for us actually to take the baton forward. And it's actually a bit questionable and doubtful whether we are still holding on to those momentums. Are we still seeing South Africa and the African continent as a destination for international trade and investment? Have we used those moments to actually build that particular momentum to attract a lot of investment in this regard? So I think in a nutshell, I think that's what he achieved, that's what he symbolized, that's what he stood for. So I think really his legacy is quite great in this area.
Well, David, thank you very, very much. I wasn't expecting you to be that brief, but can see that we're making progress. Thank you very much. Let me just carry on now and go to the man who has seen it all when it comes to South African football. Who am I talking about? I'm talking about Danny Jordaan, a former member of parliament, a former executive mayor. Well, a former couple of things, but what he still is the president. What he still is the president of the South African Football Association, and this is a man who has been there. He has seen Madiba take this country from what it was not into what it turned out to be. President Danny Jordaan, just share with us, and later, indeed, Neil Tovey, I'm still going to ask you about the Nigerian assertions that you only won AFCON because Nigeria was not there. But we'll come to that. It's also part of soccer diplomacy. President, it's your time.
Thank you very much. I must thank you for inviting me to participate in honor of Madiba. I had a good fortune of traveling with Madiba for 10 and 11 hours in the bidding process. And I can tell you, Madiba is the most wonderful storyteller. I could listen to him. And yesterday was the final. And Nelson Mandela made that memorable appearance at the FNB Stadium to wave goodbye to the friends. And millions on television viewers around the world watched and waited for that long appearance of Madiba in the 2010 World Cup and appreciated that he appeared at the final. And if we understand diplomacy to be an art of dealing with people in a sensitive and tactful manner, skill to manage international relations to win hearts and minds and not to arouse hostility, President Nelson Mandela was a super diplomat. I remember, as the NSC, we had taken a decision that the Springbok is an apartheid emblem, and therefore it must be removed and replaced by the Protea. We had already taken those decisions. And we were called by Madiba, and we met him at his house. And that was one of the most difficult days of his life. And yet he was ready to deal and engage with the sport leaders. And he said to us, look, I want to ask you, is there anyone amongst you that can tell me anything about the horrors of apartheid? We listened and said, no, Madiba. Is there anyone who can explain to me what apartheid means and what apartheid is? We said, no, Madiba. He said, okay, explain to me, why are you against the Springbok? And you have agreed you cannot tell me about apartheid, so I want you not to refer to anything of apartheid. Of course, our main argument was just taken out, and we had no argument. And then he started explaining to us about nation building, about reconciliation, about symbols, and the importance of the Springbok to rugby and its history, and so on. And so if you see, then there was a compromise that on the rugby jersey was both the Springbok and the Protea as a compromise. And so Madiba looked not at the problem, but at solutions. And when he talks about sport as the power to change the world, it's the power to inspire, it's the power to unite people, it can create hope where it's only despair, it's more powerful than government in breaking down racial barriers. Madiba pursued this path. But also, we must say that there are people like Dr. Ashwin Desai says that that nation created on a sport field crumbles in a few months. And very often people talk about sport create a 90-minute patriots. And after that, they go back to their ways. But Nelson Mandela understood that sport alone cannot achieve a non-racial and equal society. But sport is a very important trigger, contributor, or a starting point in that process. Nelson Mandela understood that the use of sport is a diplomatic tool, but clearly not the only factor in building a non-racial society. Madiba pursued an inclusive non-racial society as a commitment and as his life struggle. His first commitment to a non-racial society was not made on a sports field, but in a courtroom as an accused for fighting against racism and apartheid. In the Rivonia trial in Pretoria Supreme Court on the 20th of April 1964, he said, "During my lifetime, I have dedicated myself to this struggle of the African people. I fought against white domination and I fought against black domination. I've cherished the idea of a democratic and free society in which all persons live together in harmony and with equal opportunity. It is an ideal which I hope to live for and to achieve, but if need be, an ideal for which I'm prepared to die." So that lays at the base of Madiba's looking at sport. So when he walked into South Africa and out of the prison in 1990, he walked into becoming the country of the president of our country. But he walked into a racially divided society. He walked into a South Africa with almost all its major codes racially divided. In football, for example, we had 4 bodies pretending to be national bodies, racial separate bodies. Rugby had 2 racially divided bodies. Cricket had 2 racially divided bodies. And so did netball and hockey and swimming and all other codes. That's the first thing that Madiba walked in as he walked out of prison. The second thing is that all the major sport codes were either suspended or expelled from international bodies. Of course, that is our campaign. And of the 128 national federations, only 28 of the very small codes still had contact with international federation. So he was faced with a society far from his ideal expressed in his speech in the Rivonia trial, a free society in which all persons live together in harmony and with equal opportunities. And that, of course, comes after a long struggle for the isolation, suspension, and expulsion of South Africa. After the Sharpeville massacre in 1960, FIFA suspended South Africa in 1961. After the 1976 Soweto uprising, FIFA expelled South Africa as a member of FIFA. So by the time Madiba came out of prison, we have done our work to isolate apartheid sport from the international federations. And so the process of rebuilding the nation and reintegrating the nation as part of the international community started in the period from 1990 to 1994. And people like Samram Semi have made a major contribution in both sides of that process, in isolation and in the reintegration. The release of Nelson Mandela started the rebuilding process, and basically three tasks. One, to create single non-racial sporting bodies for all codes, to assist the codes to be accepted into international federations, even before the first democratic elections in 94, and then to focus on sport development. First example is in 1992. When FIFA expelled South Africa, they set two preconditions. One, apartheid must cease in terms of law and policy. And two, there must be a single non-racial football controlling body in South Africa. So while we had a single controlling body, South African Football Association, by 1991, apartheid was still on the books. And FIFA asked a simple question from Madiba. This process that you are engaging of negotiation, is it irreversible? Will it result in democratic elections? And Madiba said yes, and that was the end of the story. And so you will see South Africa was accepted as a member of FIFA in 1992. The first democratic elections came in 1994. There was a lot of talk of the so-called irreversibility test. Is this process irreversible? And Madiba has spent a lot of time to explain to us about this process and why it's irreversible, and that is a discussion for another day. But everybody accepted. If Madiba says so, that's the end. That guarantee they accept. This was also the case when South Africa was allowed in 1992 in the 22nd Summer Olympics in Barcelona. There, South Africa participated in an interim Olympic flag, not under the apartheid flag, and also on an anthem, which was not the apartheid anthem. So here you have, in 1992, apartheid still on the books, but the flag is not flown at the Olympics in Barcelona. The anthem is not sung, and the president of the country is not invited. Nelson Mandela is attending the opening ceremony of the Olympics, and in front of him parades the new non-racial team of South Africa. So three things were eliminated in that process. One, the apartheid flag. Two, the apartheid anthem. And three, whites-only teams. So as Madiba stood there and the team parading past him, it was a diplomatic coup for South Africa. Millions of people saw the new president, yet to be voted for and elected, standing there amongst the presidents of the world, the leaders of the Olympic movement, and all the federations of the world and teams greeting Madiba as if he was already the president of this country. And there again, Samram Semi worked closely with Madiba to achieve that. So clearly understood the power of sports diplomacy. Major sport events like the Olympics, the Football World Cup, the Rugby World Cup, were all important because their countries parade the national flag, the anthem, the teams. It demonstrates countries' organizing ability and infrastructure. The people of the country are televised to audience of millions, if not billions, worldwide. Many presidents of countries see this as a major diplomatic opportunity for their countries, and they would invite heads of state to the meetings during the event, as we've seen in the 2010 World Cup in South Africa. Presidents from South America, African states, European states, the King of Spain was present, the head of state of Germany, and many other European federations or states were there. It was clear that Nelson Mandela, from his inauguration day, on the inauguration day, he left 120 heads of state and went to watch the match Bafana Bafana versus Zambia, as he understood the power of sport. The masses in the stadium welcomed and celebrated their new president, and this was the path of South Africa's first democratically elected president, which is set on the very first day of his inauguration. It was continued with the appearance of the Rugby World Cup finals, won by South Africa 95, 96 African Cup of Nations final, won by South Africa. And this set the basis for his commitment to the 2010 bid, and finally traveled with the bidding team to Zurich and make the final presentation on the 14th of May 2004. The announcement of South Africa as the first African country to host and awarded the World Cup after a period of 100 years of FIFA history. FIFA was formed in 1904, and the first African country, South Africa, was awarded on the 15th of May 2004, 100 years later. So every country, as we've seen, every country president wants to meet Madiba. So we did not have to explain the details of our bidding plans. We simply have to present Madiba and present photo opportunities and greetings. And that was the end of that bidding process. The award of the World Cup to South Africa was very special. When Madiba said, upon receiving the trophy, "I feel like a young man of 15 years. I won't tell you what else he said. He told us that he listened to the 1966 World Cup on a radio while in prison on Robben Island. And he could never dream that this event will be hosted in his country. So it was a special moment for him." The 2010 World Cup was, of course, confronted by Afro-pessimism, fear of traveling to South Africa, and consistent talk of a plan B. And we know all of the challenges that we faced. Will they be ready? Can we trust them? Will it be safe? And lastly, will FIFA make the revenue that they expect from a World Cup? They made 2.8 billion from the World Cup in Germany. And strangely, Germany argued the same thing that we argued. Germany, you had East and West Germany. In 1990, when the wall came down, Germany argued that in order for Germany to create and build a new nation between East and West Germans to a single German nation, the World Cup would present that opportunity for nation building. I don't know whether they listened to Madiba and then use that as part of their bidding process. The impacts of sport ability to unify nations and to improve diplomatic relations has many positive examples. However, sport also has examples of creating tension and division. One such example is what is called the soccer wars between El Salvador and Honduras on the 14th of July, 1969, after a three-match series qualification for the World Cup for the 1970 FIFA World Cup in Mexico. We must point out that the border dispute between these neighboring countries, high number of Salvadoran nationals going to work in Honduras, and many other conflicts between the two countries lay at the base. But it is a fact that the three matches ignited an already inflammable situation. Nationalistic fever sparked violence, and the president of El Salvador called the Argentinian coach Bundio to tell him he must defend the national colors. This match is about national dignity. It's not about 3 points or qualification. And so at the end of the final, the bombers arrive to bomb El Salvador and retaliation in bombing Honduras in what was called the 100-hour war. Of course, a lot of the tension was generated through this match. There's also the Biafra War. In the headlines, newspaper said ask the question, did Pele stop the bloodiest civil war in Nigeria's history for 48 hours? Because Pele and Santos went to play in Nigeria, and Pele says that they were given the undertaking that there will be no fighting if they come and play in Nigeria. And although the diplomats and emissaries had tried in vain for 2 years to stop the fighting in what was then Africa's bloodiest civil war, the arrival in Nigeria of the Brazilian legend Pele brought a 3-day ceasefire to allow fans on both sides to attend the match. So for 72 hours, football was more important than the war. The Time magazine reported so in 2005. This story, however, according to the researcher Ayagbayo, says it's a myth. But Pele says that Santos managers told them that the civil war would be stopped and there would be no attacks during their visit, and indeed, there were no attacks. Football was also used in the FIFA World Cup in 1978 in Argentina, and this happened under the process, what was called by the dictators in Argentina then, the process of national reorganization of the nation, and it is essentially to murder and torture those who were called left-wing dissidents under General George Videla. But the World Cup was used as an opportunity to legitimize this dictatorial regime. Videla handed over the World Cup winners to Argentina captain Passarella, and of course, the fans celebrated, and for a moment they had forgotten the oppression and murder of a dictatorial government. Nelson Mandela's approach, however, is rooted in the struggle for democracy, in nation building, and as a moral and ethical base for sport as a contributor to society. And therefore, if we look back at what we have achieved through the support of Nelson Mandela, we were accepted by FIFA in 1992, even before the 94 elections. Madiba was there in the award of the World Cup, and we were awarded the World Cup in 2004, the 2010 FIFA World Cup. He had traveled throughout many occasions supporting the bid. And of course, Neil Tovey can tell you about Madiba. If he cannot attend the match, he would phone, and he would always talk about the importance of sport in the lives of the youth of this country, and of sport as a nation builder, and help South Africa to reintegrate into Africa first, and also into the global community. And sport gives you that platform for such integration and the building of a nation. Thank you.
All right, and that's where we're going to come out of that conversation, and that talking about Nelson Mandela's contribution to, I suppose, peace, reconciliation, and using sports, soccer, as a diplomatic tool. And of course, we have those iconic images over time, him at the AFCON, as well as the Rugby World Cup, the first one. Back in 93, I think it was, where we won the World Cup, and he wore that number 6 shirt, and it was such a great thing to see. And so throughout time, always talked about the power of sport and its ability. And Minister Natim Tuetua also speaking a little bit earlier on. He, of course, is the Minister of Sports, and he was saying pretty much the same, and we've just heard there from Danny Jordan. All right, we're going to have more for you right here on SA Today. Stay with us.